As we're getting seated here, I'd like to echo Admiral Altwig's words that he said earlier this week, comments on day one, where he said it was going to be a spectacular 3 days. And I must admit, it has been a fabulous conference. And in the words of Heidi Wood, hot damn! So we're going to get this party started. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to the 8th Annual Ronald Reagan Award Ceremony. Our host tonight is Lieutenant General Patrick J. O'Reilly of the Missile Defense Agency. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our guests seated at the head table. We ask our distinguished guest to please stand when your name is called. And for those Marines out there, we're going counterclockwise again. So remember how that goes. Okay, now that we're all in sync. We'll start with Lieutenant General Patrick J. O'Reilly, Director, Missile Defense Agency, and our host for this evening. Ambassador Henry Cooper, our guest of honor for tonight, and his charming wife, Bobby. Miss Linda Mills, President, Information Systems of Northrop Grumman. Lieutenant General Rod Kadish, United States Air Force retired, former Director, Missile Defense Agency, and former Ronald Reagan Award winner. Lieutenant General Henry Trey Oberyn III. United States Air Force retired, former Director, Missile Defense Agency. Lieutenant General Kevin Campbell, Commanding General Joint Functional Component Command, Integrated Missile Defense. Mr. Dan Smith, Vice President, Raytheon Company, and President, Integrated Defense Systems, corporate co-sponsor for this year's Missile Defense Conference. The Honorable Dr. Donald C. Winter, former Secretary of the Navy, our guest speaker for this evening, and his lovely wife, Linda. We are also honored tonight to have some of our international friends with us. Major General and Mrs. Misitru Nodomi, Defense and Army Attaché, Embassy of Japan. Major General and Mrs. Gabrielle Shavasholsky, Defense Attaché, Embassy of Italy. Brigadier General Liviu Serban, Defense Attaché, Embassy of Romania. Brigadier General Murat Yildirim, Air Force Attaché, Turkish Embassy. Mr. Ian Wallace, Counselor for Defense Policy and Nuclear, and Ms. Julie Horowitz, British Embassy. I believe congratulations is in order. Mr. Simon Cullen, Chief of Defense Force, Liaison Officer to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Embassy of Australia. Colonel Waleed Al-Shamashi, Defense, Military, Naval, and Air Attaché, Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Lieutenant Colonel Rafael Novak, Assistant Defense, Military, Naval, and Air Attaché, Embassy of the Republic of Poland. A very hearty welcome to all. At this time, if you would please stand for the presentation of colors by the United States Armed Force Color Guard from the Military District of Washington and remain standing for the singing of our national anthem performed this evening by Miss Amy Hanneman, lead soprano for the Washington Chorus.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
That was simply beautiful. Let's give her a hand. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the invocation. It is now my distinct pleasure to call upon Rear Admiral Mark Tidd, United States Navy, Chaplain of the United States Marine Corps, and Deputy Chief for the Navy Chaplains.
Will you join me for a word of prayer as we give thanks? Gracious God, we gather together this evening to enjoy each other's company, to celebrate the important work of the Missile Defense Agency, and to give thanks for the leaders you have raised up to places of great responsibility. We give thanks especially for those whom we honor this evening, knowing that we depend upon your gifts of intellect, curiosity, and determination to develop the innovations and achievements that we celebrate tonight. As we enjoy this evening together, we are mindful that our peace is guarded by men and women who tonight stand the watch around the world. May your hand ever be over them to protect them. May your presence be with their families to comfort them. May they each know that a grateful nation stands proudly beside them. And may we all rest in the knowledge that you will never leave us. Now, gracious God, we ask your blessing on the food that we will enjoy tonight, on the fellowship that we will share together, and upon those whom we honor. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. As we get ready for dinner to be served, I feel compelled to make a couple announcements. First of all, Mr. Randy Stone wanted me to let you know that if you have any problems with the quality of the food tonight, just report it to him and he'll get right on that for you. Also, if you're new and you haven't been here in the last 2 years, I really don't want any infighting on the tables, so last year I was helping the Marines and the Army guys out on which side was the bread and which side was your drink. So remember, hold your fingers together. You got a B and a D, and if you put them down, you know which one's your bread plate, and most importantly, which one's your drink plate. So cheers and have a great dinner. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our program here in a few minutes. But before we start our formal program, and while you're waiting for your dinners or dessert or whatever to show up, I thought I'd share a little story that I heard the other day. I think it was Tuesday night or whatever. A bunch of the flag officers were out in the back courtyard, and they're all boasting about, you know, what service has more courage, you know, Navy, Army, or Air Force. So Admiral Hendrickson, you know, he's kind of new to the program. He's like, well, Navy, of course, and I'll prove it. So he says, Commander Dicey. So Tom comes on up. He says, Tom, I want you to go to the top of FOB2. I want you to jump off of it, no parachute, no rope. Get on it. He's like, yes, sir. So, man, he scuttles up those stairs faster than a rabbit, gets to the edge of the bunks, does the whole Titanic pose, and drops off the edge. It was a beautiful soar, and it just splat all over the bottom of the ground. Hendrickson looks at him and said, see? Outdo that. So General Feehan, he was in the local area. He says, I'll do one up on you on that one. He said, Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, come on over here. He goes, smash, smash, come on over here. Get to the top of FOB2. Huh? And, or aim high, or I don't know what we say. Whee! So he said, he said, go to the top of FOB2. No parachute, no rope. And he goes, but I want you to do it with style. So Smash says, not a problem, sir. Walks on over the elevator, takes the elevator up, gets to the top, gets to the edge, tests the wind, takes a deep breath, pounces off the edge, does this triple gainer. It was beautiful. And then right when he's almost at the end, poof, out comes his little umbrella. But splat, out he goes, all over the ground. Hendrickson says, gotta admit, the umbrella thing, that took courage. But General O'Reilly says, boys, he calls them boys, not me, said, boys, you have no idea what courage is. So he calls over Colonel Bagnati, retired. He goes, Bags, get on over here. Bags comes on over. Yes, boss. What can I do for you? He says, Bags, once you get to the top of FOB2, no rope, no parachute, no goddamn umbrella. Just pounce off of it. Bags says, boss, are you high? What are you thinking? You know, too much sugar today, maybe too many carbs, I don't know. Yeah, I got forecast reports to do, I got Gantt charts to review. I don't have time for this. He goes, there's no flipping way. If you want to go up there, have a great time, test the air, but you're on your own, all right? I'm out of here, sir. And he walks away. General O'Reilly looks at the other two, and they're like frozen in their tracks. General O'Reilly says, now that's courage. So, with that, it is my honor to introduce the Director of Missile Defense Agency, Lieutenant General Patrick O'Reilly.
You know, one of these days, Christy's going to realize why she keeps being invited back to do this until she gets it right. First of all, thank you for coming tonight. We've had an excellent conference over the last 3 days. I would like to, though, take the opportunity, given the participants we have here, is to recognize a trend that I started on Monday. We were very fortunate to spend the day with General Abramson and get his advice and insights and so forth. But I also want to recognize the former directors that are here with us tonight. I know we've individually recognized them, but where we are today with missile defense, and of course the honoree tonight is also part of that august group. But I have a personal debt to them for the guidance and advice they've not only given me as a director, but also having, again, this is my 8th assignment to missile defense. Over my career, I'm not the only one that's benefited from their mentorship. A lot of people in this room have been set on the right path, and we've accomplished a lot in the last 28 years of this agency based on their fantastic leadership and guidance. So please, another round of applause to our former directors. As General Obering leans over to General Kadish and says, "I thought you were going to fire him." Okay, well, I'm going to stop at that. Tonight, we not only are honored to have the opportunity to honor Ambassador Cooper, who was the first director I had as I entered the missile, or SDIO at the time, back in 1989, as I recall, or 90. But we also have a great speaker here tonight that very enthusiastic over the fact that he's been kind enough to accept our offer and to not only speak to us tonight and give us his insights, but I also want to thank him for, as you've heard over the last several days, one of the key elements in the success of missile defense over the last 2 years, 2 or so years, actually 3 years, has been what you've heard referred to by many of the speakers as the Missile Defense Executive Board. And Dr. Winter, as the Secretary of the Navy, was an ardent supporter and went a long way to create and establish and raise that board to the level it is at today that we have all benefited from. So, sir, the first thing I want to do is thank you for your support, because that body has helped us make decisions that the bureaucracy itself wouldn't readily want to make, and it's been very helpful. So, Christy always, every year, finds a different page to start me on. But ladies and gentlemen, tonight I have the special honor of introducing tonight's speaker, the former Secretary of the Navy, Dr. Don Winter. The achievements of our guest speaker in government and in industry reflect his dedication to a life of service to our nation. Throughout his distinguished career, Dr. Winter has been a visionary leader in systems engineering and the development of missile defense and space technologies and systems. His depth of knowledge on how to assess ideas and the practical experience in successfully delivering capability provides Dr. Winter rare and valuable perspective on how missile defense can best contribute to the success of the nation's multi-service integrated ballistic missile defense mission. I've asked Dr. Winter to share that perspective with us tonight. It is my pleasure to recognize Dr. Winter and his lovely wife, Linda, this evening and welcome Dr. Winter to the podium to address our dinner tonight and introduce the recipient of this year's Ronald Reagan Award for his contribution to making missile defense a reality. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Winter.
Thank you, General O'Reilly. it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here tonight, particularly to be able to participate in the recognition being provided to Ambassador Cooper for his prescient leadership some 20 years ago. I am most pleased to see the MDA leadership here, both past and present, including General Kadish and General Obering. Now, much has changed in the world since President Reagan's speech initiating the U.S. Missile Defense Program. At that time, our defense posture was dominated by the threat posed by the Soviet Union, a threat evidenced by hundreds of nuclear-armed missiles aimed at the United States. Now, while the threat was formidable, our response was aided by one aspect of the Soviet system. They were a very reliable enemy. By that I mean they had a very well-established and repeatable development process, which afforded us numerous opportunities to observe the development and the fielding of their strategic rocket forces, as well as the time needed to respond. Unfortunately, our options for responding back then were limited to the development of comparable ballistic missile systems that provided the U.S. deterrent force. President Reagan recognized that while deterrence had proven effective for many years, there were risks involved, such as those associated with miscalculations or loss of control by an adversary. He had the foresight to recognize the value of an effective missile defense capability and the faith that, notwithstanding the limited state of the technology of the time, that such a system could be developed by the United States. Today, the threat has evolved, putting new impetus towards the development of an effective missile defense while complicating the design of that defense. The threat no longer comes from the Soviet Union, although we need to remain mindful of the substantial strategic rocket force retained by the Russian Federation. That said, our principal concern today is associated with the rapid proliferation of both ballistic missile and nuclear weapons capabilities to many nations around the world. In spite of diplomatic attempts to stem the tide of proliferation, it continues, aided by the Internet, the ready availability of advanced computational capabilities and dual-use components, and the willingness of rogue nations and amoral individuals motivated by the prospects of material gain. The timelines associated with proliferation are highly uncertain, and there are few observables that can be used to provide warning. We simply no longer have the ability we had with the Soviets of responding in a timely manner with the development of tailored capabilities. Furthermore, we cannot depend solely on fixed sites for surveillance purposes or weapons basing. We have to be prepared to deal with potential adversaries nearly anywhere in the world. Adversaries willing to use ballistic missiles for military purposes or as terror weapons, directed at population centers in the United States or overseas. The diversity of potential adversaries and the targets of interest to them are further complicated by the wide range of potential political and military intents for the use of ballistic missiles. The use of Scud missiles by Iraq to target Israel during the Gulf War exemplifies the wide range of intents that must be part of the calculus of missile defense for the future. Add to this the inherent vulnerability of U.S. forces on land and at sea, U.S. installations in places such as Okinawa and Bahrain, as well as the interests of coalition forces and allied nations, and we are confronted with a more complicated and more uncertain threat environment than we have ever seen. The net is that the U.S. missile defense of the near future must have the flexibility and the capability of countering a dynamic ballistic missile threat environment emanating from countries around the world and aimed at a wide range of targets. For some, these changes have come as a fairly recent epiphany precipitated by the events in North Korea and Iran. But others have been tugging the missile defense program in this direction for many years. In particular, it is interesting to note the extent to which the current MDA approach dealing with the evolving challenge is being supported by efforts that can be traced back to Ambassador Cooper's tenure as director. During that period, we find the development of the GPALS concept, the initiation of the Theater Missile Defense Program, followed by its first use, a Patriot, in the Gulf War, as well as numerous tests demonstrating the feasibility of missile defense intercepts in the ICBM domain. It is very clear that the MDA and the defense community at large greatly benefited from having, as its first civilian director, an individual with both the technical background required to lead the development of a truly transformational capability, as well as the policy background needed to understand the direction that those developments should take. The resulting product of those efforts was not only the existence proof that ballistic missile intercept was possible, but a program that spanned the spectrum of future threats that we now find ourselves facing. As we move forward into the 21st century, we are facing the real and imminent prospects of rogue nations armed with ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads, able to target U.S. interests, if not the continental United States itself. Arguments suggesting that the cost of such development and production was unaffordable for most nations, or that the timelines would stretch out indefinitely, have been disproven by the actions and achievements of nations such as North Korea and Iran. Today, we are attempting to negotiate with these nations and finding that the process is far different and far more difficult from that which we used with the Soviet Union. Furthermore, we have little reason to believe that we can trust such nations to abide by any definitive agreement or to receive their cooperation in verifying compliance. Perhaps most importantly, we must recognize that these nations do not represent the totality of the future threat to the free world, particularly given the way that ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons technologies have proliferated of late. The only viable alternative for us is to follow in the footsteps of Ambassador Cooper, to continue the development and deployment of missile defense capabilities so that our nation can respond to the evolving threat. Hopefully, to dissuade others from making the investments needed to field ballistic missiles. Most likely, to deter those with ballistic missiles from using them. And, when needed, to defeat those ballistic missiles so that God may continue to bless our nation and the free world. Thank you all very much. And Ambassador Cooper, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Winder. And thanks, boss, for throwing me under the bus like that. I was just asking myself, gee, you know, is it third time's charm or 3 strikes you're out? But I'm just another redo, so back in the barrel I go. It is now time for the award presentation for this evening. It is fitting that we hold this dinner each evening at the Ronald Reagan Center. And not just for the reason that you're all thinking. We all know the role that President Reagan played in establishing the missile defense program. After all, that is why we bestow our annual award in his name. But it's also important to remember something of the very nature of the man himself. Throughout his life, he carried with him a strong sense of optimism and an abiding love of his country. At the stage when some said that United States time had passed, Ronald Reagan personified confidence that his nation, his shining city on the hill, had its best days to come. To put it quite simple, Ronald Reagan was an American patriot. Now, to honor this year's recipient of the Ronald Reagan Award for Meritorious Achievement, we've compiled a short video that highlights the distinguished career in the missile defense of Ambassador Henry F. Cooper. Please play the video.
President Ronald Reagan dreamed of a world free from the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. He challenged the idea that the best way to ensure the safety and security of the American people was to leave them vulnerable to a massive nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. On March 23, 1983, he first shared his vision of a more hopeful world in which stability rested not on the madness of assured destruction, but on the promise of assured survival.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The Ronald Reagan Award for Meritorious Achievement in Missile Defense honors those who carry on the legacy of President Reagan through their exceptional contributions to the development of missile defense capabilities for the United States. Their visionary leadership and selfless dedication have ensured that President Reagan's dream is closer than ever to becoming a reality. This year, we recognize Ambassador Henry F. Cooper for his unwavering commitment and steadfast support for advancing the technologies necessary to achieve this noble purpose. Ambassador Cooper began his involvement in missile defense in the early 1960s, working on the Nike Zeus program, the first serious effort by the United States to develop an anti-ballistic missile, or ABM, capability against intercontinental ballistic missiles. He also applied his technical expertise to the design of the first operational U.S. ABM system known as Safeguard. Ambassador Cooper later served in the United States Air Force, and then as a scientific advisor to the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, where he studied the effects of nuclear weapons testing to help formulate plans for assuring the survivability of U.S. strategic offensive forces. Under President Reagan, he provided oversight for Air Force strategic and space systems and implemented the President's ambitious program for modernizing U.S. nuclear forces. As Assistant Director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, he was the primary author for U.S. space arms control policy and played a key role in public affairs activities supporting the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. Ambassador Cooper continued to follow the development of the SDI program as Deputy and then Chief U.S. Negotiator at the Defense and Space Talks with the Soviet Union. During his time in Geneva, he was instrumental in defending SDI from repeated Soviet attempts to pressure the United States into giving up the program. As the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union started to disintegrate, the threat of a large-scale Soviet missile attack gave way to the dangers of a more unpredictable security environment. Ambassador Cooper was chosen by the Secretary of Defense to conduct an independent review of the SDI program to assess the technical possibilities and programmatic options for meeting the strategic demands of a rapidly changing world. He subsequently recommended redirecting the program to provide a comprehensive layered defense against unauthorized launches and missile strikes of more limited scope. Ambassador Cooper was later appointed Director of the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization to oversee the development of this new defensive strategy.
We're talking about a limited number of incoming reentry vehicles, tens to 100 or so, and we're talking about attacks on our forces overseas, our friends and allies as well. The source of the missiles might be the Soviet Union, could be third countries, some that we know about today, but possibly others that might gain the capability in the future.
he set out to evaluate the status of missile defense research in the United States and to formulate an operational concept that would take advantage of the most mature technologies in order to provide the best defense in as short a time as possible. The result was an integrated defensive architecture comprised of a revolutionary space-based defense known as Brilliant Pebbles, a ground-based national missile defense, and advanced theater missile defenses.
Such defenses could protect U.S. forces deployed overseas, U.S. power projection forces, U.S. friends and allies, as well as the United States itself against accidental, unauthorized, and limited ballistic missile attacks. We call this system a Global Protection Against Limited Strikes System, or GPALS.
From the beginning, Ambassador Cooper sought to apply innovative acquisition approaches to the program in order to place operational capabilities in the hands of the warfighter more quickly. In the build-up to the First Persian Gulf War, he directed SDIO scientists and engineers to assist Air Force Space Command in modifying Defense Support Program satellites to provide early warning of Iraqi missile launches against Allied forces deployed in the region. The events of Operation Desert Storm less than a year later vividly illustrated the critical need for a global defense like GPALS, with improved theater missile defenses leading the way. As a result, during the State of the Union address in 1991, President Bush formally announced his intention to refocus SDI to provide a defense against limited missile attacks. Ambassador Cooper moved quickly to facilitate the transition directed by the President, and later supported by Congress in the Missile Defense Act of 1991. Under his skillful leadership, SDIO underwent significant programmatic and management changes that reflected the shifting priorities and objectives of the organization. He moved forward with a program to develop and deploy the initial site of a ground-based defense for the U.S. homeland. At the same time, he also directed the development of a robust theater missile defense program. He shrewdly recognized the value of sea-based missile defenses and worked closely with the U.S. Navy to upgrade the Aegis air defense system to intercept ballistic missiles. He also strongly supported increasing Allied participation in the GPAL system and expanding joint development efforts like the U.S.-Israeli Arrow Interceptor. Amid growing opposition to space-based missile defenses, he formulated the idea for the groundbreaking Deep Space Program Science Experiment, better known as Clementine. Using hardware scavenged from Brilliant Pebbles demonstration programs, the mission yielded invaluable scientific observations of the lunar surface and proved the viability of Brilliant Pebbles technologies. Since departing SDIO in 1993, Ambassador Cooper has remained a determined advocate for building a global, layered defense against ballistic missiles as quickly as possible, regardless of political considerations or implications. He has vigorously supported building on technology proven during the SDI era to pursue sea and space-based systems as the most technically sound and cost-effective options available. Today, because of the vision, leadership, and support of Ambassador Cooper, the Missile Defense Agency is developing, testing, and fielding an integrated layered defense against ballistic missiles of all ranges and in all phases of flight. The agency also carries on his legacy of advancing the technologies necessary to hedge against the growth of future missile threats and expanding international cooperation to support common security interests. For his exceptional dedication and tireless commitment to pursuing the rapid and systematic development of effective missile defense capabilities for the United States, Ambassador Henry F. Cooper is presented with the 2010 Ronald Reagan Award for Meritorious Achievement in Missile Defense.
I now invite Ambassador Cooper to join Dr. Winter and General Riley at center stage to receive his award.
How do we do this?
Sir, on behalf of myself and the agency, it's my personal honor to present you the Ronald Reagan Award for this year. Thank you,
Thank you
sir.
very much. I really appreciate this.
Congratulations. Yeah, I think we need to pose here for a photo.
Oh, get in the middle. Thank you very much.
So the podium is yours.
Wow, I don't know what to say. I hadn't expected that kind of a tribute. I was going to retrace a little bit of history with you folks, but I got more. I'm not sure that I can tell as good a tale as what was told there, and I'm not sure you should believe all that anyway. So, Mr. Secretary, Generals, whoever, all of you guests here, I really appreciate your being here tonight, honoring me and honoring the memory of Ronald Reagan and his initiative, without which I don't believe we would be here this evening. I would like to, just in a few minutes, maybe say a few things to you that you didn't hear in the rest of the conference. And I was going to say that you hadn't heard at all, but some of this reflects what you just witnessed in this embarrassing demonstration or whatever. I wanted to recap, 50 years at least of my wandering through this subject. 50 years ago, I went to Bell Laboratories and as was indicated, worked on a program called Nike Zeus that morphed into the Safeguard program that was deployed as a byproduct of the arms control business. I've talked to Henry Kissinger about this and understand how the decisions were made, and of course was dismantled within a month of it becoming operational, all as a product of arms control and the ABM Treaty, which then, after 1972, hobbled us for some 30 years. And I've railed against that subject, I think, ever since. In fact, it was reading the transcript from the Moscow press conference that Henry Kissinger gave in 1972 that attracted me to arms control. At the time, I was a young fellow out at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory worrying about the survivability of our strategic forces and so on. And basically, that transcript said that he thought that we needed this treaty because we couldn't compete with the Soviet Union. It wasn't exactly a quote, but that's basically what he said. And I couldn't believe it. And as an American, I didn't think it made sense then. I don't think it makes sense now. But I figured that if I ever wanted to see the strategic programs that I believed in come into being, I had to understand what this arms control world was all about. And that was my enticement to go to the West Coast and do some learning, and then eventually to come back to Washington and eventually get engaged in the process myself. Some 30 years ago, I was in the Air Force Secretariat and worrying about where we stood with respect to the Soviet Union and our strategic forces. And we were pressing to begin a serious modernization program. And in the summer of 1980, we had a summer study. Tom Reed led it. Some of you may remember who Tom Reed was. He was Secretary of the Air Force eventually, before then actually, and eventually was a close advisor to Reagan. And it was to look at the ICBM problem in particular, strategic forces in general, but our vulnerability of our ICBMs and what we should do about it. As one of the studies that was done, we looked at defending the ICBMs. That had been what missile defense had been relegated to after the 1972 treaty, because that forbade defenses of the American people, so the only thing we could defend was our strategic forces, and even then, and only in a limited way. There was a program that some of you may recall called LOADS, Low Altitude Area Defense. I think that was what the acronym stood for, I'm not sure. but it was a preferential defense of the Minuteman silos in the existing fields. And it was less expensive by a factor of 2 than the MX options and all the basic modes we considered, but we were not inclined to do that because the ABM Treaty, of course, would not let us build that system, or at least that was the judgment of folk at the time. It was even during this period, I might say, that folks like Dan Quayle, and some others, I believe Ted Kennedy was part of the group, pressed to make a program called SAM-D and capable against ballistic missiles. Dennis Picard, I see sitting down here, I assume he can verify some of what I'm saying. And they argued that we should provide a capability to defend against ballistic missiles with this air defense system. And I don't recall whether it was called Patriot then or not. But what I do recall is that it limped forward year by year. The House would zero it in the budget. The Senate would put some money in, and then it would split the difference in the conference every year. And they limped along until the Gulf War came along. And as I recall it, when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait on August the 2nd, and I remember that because we were hosting Maggie Thatcher out in Colorado Springs. You saw the picture at the time. That's where she got the phone call from President Bush, and she told him, "Now is no time to go wobbly, George." So she told me later. In any case, we limped along, and when the Gulf War started some 6 months later, because of the initiative, I believe, of a colonel down in Huntsville, pretty much on his own recognizance, and turning on the production lines, we had interceptors that could be used in that war. At the time that Saddam went into Kuwait, I think we had 3 for testing. It had never been tested, and in spite of all the arguments about how effective the system was or wasn't, for an untested weapon system, it was a hero of that war for political reasons, if not technical ones, because once the defenses were there, people went back to work, and you know, I've been told by the Israelis at the time what a great benefit it was. So that proved early on, that term, you know, mutual assured destruction on the head, defenses was a stabilizing factor in that war, not for the reasons that people thought about. But I jumped ahead of my story. I wanted to say that, you know, after 27 years ago, actually, tonight, about then, it was the day after Reagan made his speech, Andropov tabled a letter or an announcement back to the United States about what a disaster this was going to be and how it would lead to an arms race in space. It was completely destabilizing. That was echoed by the liberal left in this country, who were proponents of the ABM Treaty and all that stood for, and the mutual assured destruction and so on. I remind you, if you think the political season is bad right now, of what that was like at the time. This was 1983. This was a year before the election. We were in the middle of a continuous worldwide campaign called the Nuclear Freeze Movement, which was again pressed on not moving ahead with our modernization of our strategic programs or dealing with that in any sensible way, but basically, you know, we build down and maybe the Russians will do like us. Does this sound familiar? Any case, that was the nature of the argument at the time, and I remember giving talks around the country and trying to deal with this. It was really tough sledding. October of 1983, the Russians, we deployed the Pershing and the ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe. This was a big fight. I believe it was NATO's highest point. I don't think any time before then or since have we seen unity as we had it in those days. under a worldwide propaganda campaign and political force. And I believe every one of the deployment nations and we as the principal suppliers for the Pershing and the Glickam went through national elections that year. And every government stood up to the pressure. And in October of 1983, we began the deployments of INF. Russians, true to form, the Soviets, I'm sorry, there were a few others besides the Russians, walked out of the talks. Not just START and INF, but all of the talks to add the pressure. And that was the heat on Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1984, and happily he won by overwhelming margin. I don't remember. I think he lost one state. I'm not sure of that. Some of you politicos can tell me. But that was daunting to the Russians. And I was at the State Department in ACTA, an organization which no longer exists. My responsibility was backstopping talks that didn't exist at that moment. And there were back and forth squirming around after the election of how you could start the talks again. And a fig leaf was put together to have new arms control talks that lumped together START, the INF, and SDI, which was what the Russians wanted to kill, the Soviets wanted to kill, and particularly the space part. So in March of 1985, back to whatever that is, 25 years ago, something like that, I went off to Geneva, and never did this engineer ever figure, and I'm no diplomat, those of you who know me know that's the case. It was very hard to bite my tongue through an awful lot of that, but I am stubborn. And it turns out that fit the bill for what Reagan was interested in, because he was looking for creative ways to say "niet" on SDI, and that was my job, frankly. And I remember how gratified I was at Reykjavik when he made it ever so plain to Gorbachev that he was not going to trade it away, in spite of the fact, trade SDI away, in spite of the fact that Gorbachev made some pretty impressive moves toward the positions that we were advocating. Ultimately turned into the zero INF agreement and a 50% reductions in START. And eventually during the Bush administration in '91, the INF agreement in '87. And true to our form, we never gave up anything on the SDI. You may remember at Reykjavik, October of '85, I guess it was, Reagan walked out. He left the talks because Gorbachev was demanding that we restrain the testing of space systems to the laboratory, and Reagan wouldn't hear of it. It took a U.S. Congress and a U.S. president to stop the space programs. The Russians couldn't do it, at least while Reagan was there. Well, those were heady days, and I'm really proud of the time, the role that I played there. I do believe, as I said, that SDI made enormous difference in bringing the Soviets back to the table and getting them to negotiate seriously. Marshal Akramayov, who was in charge of all the Soviet strategic forces at the time, told, I think he was Ambassador Vernon Walters at the time from, I don't know whether he was with the UN or at Bonn, as our ambassador to Germany, that this was the watershed event. This was the event that really made it clear to Gorbachev that we were not going to give on these issues, and within months we saw Glasnost and Perestroika unfold, and Gorbachev certainly deserves credit for those initiatives. I don't deny that, but he was trying to revive a system, to refold it, and so on. And it was Reagan's steadfastness and U.S. technology and our capabilities and know-how that fundamentally broke the back, I believe, of the Soviet Union. It wasn't long after that Reagan left office and new administration came in, and I don't remember whether the video showed the Berlin Wall coming down, but that was coming down. And Secretary Cheney requested that I do a study for him on what should happen with the SDI program. It was running into budget troubles on the Hill, and it was pretty clear that moving straight ahead with the program was going to run into political difficulty. This was before the Gulf War. And so I did a study that reported out in March of 1990. Now we're up to 20 years ago. And as was indicated by Secretary Winter, I urged an initiative called GPALS. Joe Braddock, who some of you may know, he's the B in the old BDM, wherever it resides now, led a Defense Science Board on the proliferation issues. And it was very impressive, at least to me, when I was doing this study, and it was clear that we were going into a very different world. Many people who had ballistic missiles who could threaten, if not us, at least our allies and troops abroad. And so we invented the term theater missile defenses because of the, I think there was a program that we had for theater strategic forces or something, I forget what it was called, TNF, theater nuclear forces, I guess it was. And we took that as a lead and argued for including that as a principal objective of the new SDI program, and that we should deal with threats wherever they existed in the world, and not only at that time, but where they might exist in a proliferating environment in the future. And it had to have a global capability, since we wouldn't know where the threat would necessarily be coming from. It wanted to move away from the Soviet Union as the primary means of the threat. Les Aspin and Sam Nunn had been advocating programs, they called them ALPS, Accidental Launch Protection System, and I forget other acronyms. So friends on the Hill that I had gotten to know in the talks in Geneva, I knew would support the idea of defending against limited attacks, accidental launch attacks, perhaps, out of the Soviet Union. So that was the genesis of the GPALS idea, global protection against limited strikes. As I was saying in there, global because it was worldwide, limited because we weren't after defending against thousands of reentry vehicles, and I couldn't get the JCS to tell me what a limited number should be that we should design against. So I said, I'll take a rogue submarine or captain, and we had 200 as the limit because that was the max number at the time that was carried on a Soviet SSBN. And so that's what we started with. We made a lot of progress, I thought, in those years, intellectually and thinking about what it would take. Some of the issues that I suspect you're wrestling with today were issues that we talked about in terms of the global needs of a command and control system, how it had to be integrated together, how, in fact, in my judgment, if you go back to a report called the Eastport Report that I'm sure if Abe were here, he could recall, 1985 report that dealt with the command and control issues, and you have to be prepared to delegate to the low levels in order to make this work. High-level folk don't like to hear that, but that's the reality, and the sooner we can get that message through, the better. But in any case, this was a heady time for me, and I think we made a great deal of progress in moving ahead. One of the most notable and pleasant recollections of this period was dealing with the Navy. I just pointed out, I was an Air Force officer. I had worked with the Army on Zeus, but I knew nothing about the Navy culture. And yet, when I did this study and said I want a global defense, and you look at the globe and all that water, and surely it must be useful. And the Navy had played no major, I didn't mean it that way, but useful in terms of, of a global defense, you see. And I didn't know anybody in the Navy, frankly, at the time, had not worked with them. I knew the culture was different than the other services. And I didn't know what to do. And I don't know whether J.D. Williams is here tonight or not. Vice Admiral Williams at the time, whether he or Rod Rempt, I don't know who got to who, but we got together, and together we sold Admiral Kelso on the idea that there should be a Navy role in missile defense. And I remember telling Admiral Kelso, who was the CNO, that you've got to be very careful in how you formulate this program, back to my other theme, because if you give it too much capability, the liberals will kill you. You know, because the ABM Treaty, Article 5, says you can't even test it if it can defend the American people. So it fit well into the theater defense part of GPALS. And the good news is that you know, JD sent Rod Remp down to work with me to get the program started, and that's the way we did it. And we got by with it, at least through the time that we got rid of the treaty in 2002, finally. My not only regret, but one of my great regrets is that after we got rid of the treaty, it seems like the system was stuck on the idea that you can only do theater defense from ships. And the only reason why I pressed that on the Navy in the beginning was because if they would enable the system, all it is inherently capable of doing, then the treaty and the lawyers and our opponents would have killed the program. We wouldn't have gotten anything. So it is with a great deal of pride that I note today we've got, is it 19? I see Admiral Altwig there. How many ships at sea? 20? 20 ships at sea. I think 3 in the Atlantic and the rest in the Pacific. And they have at least a limited capability. And thanks to our friends from Japan, where was this over here? My applause to you, sir. Frankly, if it had not been for you, those ships wouldn't be at sea. They brought money to the table, but more than that, they insisted on using the current infrastructure in our Navy ships. And if we had gone and built a bigger, faster missile, which there may be some rationale for, we wouldn't have what we have today. So, you know, that's a great, that's an observation and a great satisfaction to me as to how we got to where we are. And I think we're not done with the Navy, and eventually we'll realize the dreams that we had, the vision that we had. When I talked to Kelso to begin with and said, but don't go too quickly. I'd like to have gone quickly after 2002, trust me, but there was good reason to begin with of not giving it more capability than we did. I think I can't say enough about the role of Congress in all of this. And we have friends there and we have enemies there. Through some of the hard times we had, they were the ones who kept the missile defense program on a reasonable track. There were times when the program was gutted in pieces and overall with budget cuts and specific direction and so on. And there were times in when our friends on the Hill insisted that there be something done differently than was going on in the executive branch. Kurt Weldon, who is no longer there, is very proud of the 1998 Missile Defense Act, which made it the law of the land that we were going to defend the American people. And without that, I'm not sure what would have gone on with the ground-based system during the latter days of the Clinton administration, but happily, in any case, it did go on, and we have systems deployed in Alaska and California today. And there's no doubt but what Congress played an enormously important role in all of that. My main regret in all of this is that I don't see any space component. And back to, you know, the thing that was Reagan's passion, he wanted a global defense too. He, for whatever his reasons, believed that space was very important in this. I don't pretend to know why he thought what he did, but I don't think it had anything to do with Bonzo the Clown, you know, whatever he was. Reagan was a much deeper thinker than people gave him credit for. It's true, I think, that he slept through a lot of meetings, but some of those meetings you'd sleep through too. I would prefer to. Anyway, you might be embarrassed not to stay awake. But things that Reagan cared about, he was thoughtful about, and he had his own way of pressing for what he wanted. And SDI was something he truly cared about. I think he inherently understood the importance of space. I have to admit to you, one political shortcoming maybe was bringing up to him in 1988 the concern that, well, through friends anyway, I had and some others had, that the Defense Authorization Bill was capping the spending on space-based interceptors. And that was the time that, through friends anyway, we brought out of the closet the Brilliant Pebbles program that was going on at Livermore, and Reagan vetoed the 1989 Defense Authorization Bill. I don't think Sam Nunn ever forgave us for that. And so on my watch, he made it clear that he was going to kill the program one way or another. And they sliced it a couple of years in a row. And that's when, as in the movie, I called in Pete Worden and Rip Worrell, I guess it was, and said, I want to invent a program that even our arch enemies will support to prove out the technologies that we have been developing on the space interceptors. And that's where Clementine came from. And if you want to see it, or a replica of it, you can go over to the Smithsonian, because it was incredibly successful. It was an $80 mission. Within 2 years of that meeting in my office, launched off. The Clinton administration let us do it, I think, because they expected it to fail. And it succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. And so when the follow-on was going to come off, because again, our friends in Congress wanted to proceed with this, President Clinton used his line item veto to kill that follow-on program, even though it had the support of Carl Sagan, the Academy of Sciences, and a whole host of people who had opposed SDI. That technology is viable, and my great regret is that I don't believe it is being used today in the programs that are being pursued. It was so politically incorrect that the programs were killed, the community of people working on those activities were dispersed, the files were purged, and I don't, that's not to say you're not doing good things, all of you out here, but I think we missed a great opportunity and exploiting some of the very best technologies that came out of SDI, certainly on my watch. And I'd love to see something done to revive all that. I can't end this up after saying what I did about arms control at the beginning without saying I'm troubled by what's going on right now. I think it's very important in the context especially of what we might eventually do in space that we not permit the Russians and the Chinese in particular to block our eventual utility and use of some of these key technologies in going to space. I know there's no program today, and I know there's very little chance that anything can be done in the political environment to start it today. The thing I would hate to see is another 30 years of delay and divergence because of some treaty that gets signed this year that blocks our path toward using the very best technologies that America has to defend our people. I think it's a great tribute to the people in this room and the people of both parties on the Hill and in the administrations that we today are no longer arguing about whether missile defense ought to be a key arm of our forces. That's not the issue. Thank goodness. The issue is what missile defense should it be, how much, where should it be, how effective can you make it? And to my answer to that is that we should make it all it can be, if I can borrow an Army term, and we should do our very best with the best of American technology to defend the people of this great country. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I talked too long. And And thank you for this.
I would like to close tonight by thanking once again Ambassador Cooper for letting us honor him. It is truly evident in not only the film but his remarks what it takes and from our early pioneers in this area that have laid the foundation that we are benefiting from today. Has been said by many of our speakers in the last 3 days, and as Ambassador Cooper has correctly pointed out, you no longer hear the discussion of if missile defense, but more of, and to be honest, sir, what I hear all the time is, as General Petraeus said to me after a presentation in the AOR a few months ago, he had 2 words: more and faster. And so, Ambassador, it is clearly understood what the benefit of missile defense is. I would like to thank, again, AIAA on their partnership for this conference, and especially our corporate sponsor this year, Raytheon. Dan Smith, thank you very much for your support. And I would like to remind everybody that a year from now, we will also be holding this conference. And in the meantime, with some flashbacks of a former director of MDA dressed as a Shogun that's still embedded on my mind, we are going to have our next multinational conference in Kyoto in late September. And it wasn't General Obering as the Shogun, but I'll never forget this image of a director of MDA with Admiral Page as a geisha girl. So it's one of those memories that I just can't get rid of, and I will promise it will not be repeated. But we will look forward to seeing everybody in Kyoto in late September. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.